Hey guys, Will here. We decided to do our project on comic books since comics are literature too. I'll start things off with the history. In 1849, the year the California Gold Rush began, the first comic to bear similarity to those that we see today, albeit not a lot, but it was vaguely similar, it was called Journey to the Gold Diggings. Production of such comics was extremely limited due to the current printing technology. Mass production wasn't feasible until later in the century, about the 1890s. When the great newspaper titans of William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer brought in the new age of yellow journalism and mass newspaper production, comics could take off. Hearst was responsible for the introduction of newspaper comic strips, but it was Pulitzer that introduced the character the Yellow Kid and eventually speech bubbles as archived by the Ohio State University. By the 30s, comics had gained enough momentum that they could become their own business. One such business, Detective Comics, created the now legendary Superman in 1938, and the concept of the superhero was born. The bombing of Pearl Harbor and the start of the U.S.'s involvement in World War II ushered in an age of patriotism that comics reflected. DC created Wonder Woman, and Timely Comics, who would soon eventually become Marvel, introduced Captain America. Despite the popularity of superheroes fighting the Axis, Disney's own comics surrounding their characters continued to outsell them. Children liked Mickey Mouse more than Captain America. In 1953, certain concern regarding the content of comic books began to arise, and a belief of them being linked to juvenile delinquency emerged. The Comics Code Authority was consequently created to regulate comics. The 1980s were the start of an era of modern comics. To make money, the characters couldn't just be flashy anymore. They were given a great deal of psychological depth and a sense of relatability. This even applied to villains. Take the arch-nemesis of the X-Men, for example, Magneto. He's a survivor of the Auschwitz concentration camp who was born with mutant superpowers. In a world where the ordinary people oppress mutants, he fights for them and believes that they can't peacefully coexist with the normal populace. Yet he has worked with the X-Men on numerous occasions. It was during this same period of time anti-heroes cropped up in comic books. Characters like Venom and Deadpool weren't entirely evil or good. The 90s brought forth a darker artistic style of comics, most notably Batman. He had gone from the classic corny image brought forth by Adam West in that 60s television show to what we see in the 1989 movie. This was a result of comics becoming more character-driven and having realistic motivations. After that film release, other comics began to imitate the dark style that Batman underwent in the 80s. The year of 93 was an awful year for comics. At that time, the idea of novelty issues and that one day comics would become incredibly valuable, like a character's first issue, was a cash grab. Publishers were reprinting these old titles while simultaneously printing new comics. There was just too many being made that what could be sold. Several sources from the Washington Post and Marvel themselves even admit that they went bankrupt in 96 because of it. They have since bounced back. Film adaptations of comics brought money back into the industry, and they became crucial to their survival. To put it in perspective, Disney paid $4 billion for Marvel in 2009.
Hi, I'm Austin, and I covered the modern influence of comics. The modern era of comics is from the 1980s through about the present day. The biggest comics at the time were a little more serious in nature that helped lead to comics such as Watchmen and Hellblazer. However, this was around the same time someone else took an interest in comics, which was Hollywood. Starting the trend was Warner Bros. In 1989 with the Michael Keaton Batman. This movie grossed around $40 million its opening weekend. With the success of the Batman movie, movies would continue to be made through the 90s, with titles including Batman Returns, Spawn, and Blade. However, the comic market crashed due to the amount of comics being in production, causing a comic inflation. This led to the comics working with the movies and either expanding on the universe, such as the Star Wars comics, or being the foundation of the movies with comics like Spider-Man. With comics setting the pace or expanding on the universe from the late 90s to 2000, there was a series from the Marvel that would be the biggest influence of comics ever. That series is the Infinity Wars. Hollywood, using its influence from comics, would start all the origin stories for the Avengers, which was the highest grossing superhero movie ever at the time. With the success of the Avengers movie, you could not see at least one store that did not have an Avengers item in it, from toys to blankets and collectible figures. And just about anything they could stamp an Avengers symbol on, people needed a conclusion for the movies. This is where the movies looked back to the comics for finish and made the movie Endgame, which was the record breaker of all types of movies, such as the highest grossed weekend fastest grossing movie, and many more records. Comics went mainstream and people wanted to learn more about superheroes. We do not know what the next big influence from comics is, but we know that comics will be around to help inspire people from all aspects.
Hi, this is Isaac, and I did art styles in comics. Art styles in comics started in black and white with some color. This is because comics started out in newspapers. The first newspaper comic was put into a newspaper on February 16th, 1896, in a newspaper called the Hearst New York American. The comic strip was called The Yellow Kid, and as you expect, it does not look much like comics you would see today or earlier. As you can see from the picture of the Yellow Kid, the art style is very different from what you see nowadays. It is much harder to understand the dialogue. This led to many new comic strips starting in newspapers. Some big comics include Yogi Bear, Garfield, and Snoopy. These comics are very different than the Yellow Kid. These include panels with dialogue and cartooning that is much easier to understand. The age of comic books started in the US around the 1950s, but before there were few being made. The first comic book that was made like today's comics was made in 1931, and it was The Adventures of Mickey Mouse, made by Walt Disney. The first comic book was The Yellow Kid, but is not like you would see today. Most art styles of comics at this time was cartooning, which was a display of animated characters that often had short bodies with long arms and were not supposed to look real. Marvel, as you know, is a huge movie franchise. Marvel started with comics along with many other movie franchises. Marvel came out with their first comic in 1939, and it was called Marvel Comics, because specific Marvel comics for superheroes had not been created yet. The art style for Marvel was very realistic looking people doing very unrealistic things like flying, teleporting, etc. Marvel was actually not the first to come up with superhero-supervillain concept. It was actually DC who came out with their first comic in 1934. DC had a very similar style, but they took a darker approach with more villains than Marvel. Marvel was known to have more sales in comics, but DC is said to have more popular characters. Next, I'm going to be talking about manga. Manga comics, otherwise known as anime. Manga was a huge comic in Japan that later moved into the US. The concept of manga came into effect around the early 1800s. Manga comics were huge in Japan and still are, but in the US didn't start to gain popularity until the 1960s. The first popular manga comic in the US was called Astro Boy, and it was Japan's most popular comic of the 60s. This led to some very big comics being produced in the US. Two huge comics are Naruto and Dragon Ball Z, which I'm pretty sure these are two comics that almost everyone has heard of. There are many art styles in manga. If you are children, shonen, shoujo, seinen, and hosei, all of these styles are used to show the age group it's aimed toward. So obviously children is pretty easy to guess. Shonen is aimed toward teen boys, which means the style is going to have a lot of action and adventure. An example of shonen is Naruto and Dragon Ball. Next one is shoujo, is meant for teenagers. Seinen is meant for ages 20 to 50, and it will be more violent with darker images. Lastly, josei is going to be aimed towards women, and the stories will be more romantic and realistic, along with the drawing style being more realistic.
Hi, my name's Nate, and I'm presenting the summation of everyone's slides. Comics and history and art and everything. Comics have influenced movies, television, art, and even literature. As Austin talked about, he presented the modern influence of comics, and as you can see on the left, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. If you watch closely, the animation is presented in 12 frames per second. That's Miles Morales, the main character. He's presented in 12 frames per second, which shows the choppiness of comics and how it feels to read a comic. it doesn't feel fluid. It feels like you're actually reading it when you're watching the movie. And everything around him is 24 frames a second in animation, so it feels more fluid. Towards the middle of the movie, when Miles Morales gains his spider powers, and he swings, the next change is he's 24 frames per second, which shows that he's gained his spider powers. He feels more fluid. But everything else, like old fat Spider-Man, he is 12 frames per second, and he stays like that for the rest of the movie until the end. He switches to 20 frames per second. Comics are in every art form, just like what Isaac talked about. There are grittier comics. There's manga, which has influenced anime, and starting in the mid to 1800s, just like what Will talked about, comics blossomed into an amazing literature. And the 50s and so on, we had the Golden Age, the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age, and so on. So many kids were inspired by literature and comics. Many of them became comic artists and authors as well. Some became directors, like the Russo brothers, who directed The Avengers. And don't forget the art styles. So the Golden Age was from 1938 to 1950. This is an original Superman comic, Action Comics. This was before Detective Comics DC. And then you had the Silver Age, this is an example of Silver Age comics. This is Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. This is the Bronze Age. This is the Punisher, first issue. As you can see from the previous style, it seems a bit more grittier. And then you have the Dark Age of comics, which shows a little bit. If you were to read comics in the 90s, you'd probably be like, what happened to brighter colors? What happened to everything? This one, the Dark Age of the comics, was bloodier, grittier. It felt dirty to like read. It felt like I had mud in my hands when I was reading comics from the Dark Ages. And now you have the Ageless comics. This is newer comics from this is present day comics. As you can see, things can be gritty, things can be colorful, things can be beautiful as a sense of art. And this is Saga, and this one, as I can say, this is the gritty one. This is the Walking Dead comics. And this was our presentation over comics or literature too. Excelsior.